Okay, well, I will go ahead and get us started. And Emily, if you don't mind helping with the waiting room. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our DAD Diversity Committee Community Chat. This is the first of our three-part series this fall and going into the winter. And we're really excited to kick off this first chat on racial and ethnic representation in autism research. And so this afternoon, we're going to do an overview of disparities in representation. Very briefly, I'll kick off with that. And then we're going to have some research snapshots from our panelists on IEPs, disparities in service provision, and then evidence-based practice research. But first, I'm really excited to have an awesome panel of guests. And so I want to start with each of you, if you don't mind doing just a brief introduction, and I will start with Dr. Renita Anderson. Thank you for being here.
Hi, my name is Renita. Oh, no problem. Hi, I'm Renita. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC, where I am doing work on a lot of things around autism spectrum disorders and family navigation. And my background is in speech language pathology.
Thank you, Renita. And Dr. Jeanette Artis.
Hi, I am Jeanette, and I am also a postdoctoral researcher. I'm at New York University, and my research is focusing on autism and a lot of looking at their early language development.
Thank you. Dr. Kara Hume.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm an associate professor in the School of Ed, also at UNC Chapel Hill, and my work focuses on community-based interventions, specifically in schools, and identifying evidence-based practices.
Thanks, Kara. And last but not least, Dr. Jess Steinbrenner.
Hi, I'm Jessica Steinbrenner. Thanks for joining. I am an associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences, also at UNC, and kind of ditto what Kara said. I've done a lot of school-based research, and the research we're highlighting today is a systematic review of evidence-based practices.
Thank you so much. So again, we are super excited to have this awesome panel. And for those of you who may not know me, I'm Jamie Pearson. I am one of the DAD Division on Autism and Developmental Disability members at large, and also the Diversity Committee Chair. And so I've worked with our doctoral student liaison and also our DEI liaisons who are on our committee or on the call today to plan a series of community chats. And we're also kind of continuing the work of some of my other colleagues who have planned these in the past. And so our diversity committee is really committed to advocating for the rights and safety for individuals with autism, intellectual disabilities, and developmental disability, and the professionals who support them. And so we really like to think about the importance and engage in work that supports intersectional contributions to the field in the support of individuals with disabilities. And so before we kind of jump into this, I wanted to give just a very brief sort of introduction to this work. And my own work is around supporting Black autistic youth and their families. And so our panelists today are going to talk about some of these intersections, but also the need to engage in research and practice that addresses the underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in autism research. So that's kind of our overarching goal for today. Some of the things that I wanted to highlight briefly before we jump into the snapshots are, there is similar prevalence in terms of autism identification across racial and ethnic backgrounds, but we still see disparities in terms of how Black and Latinx families and children are able to access and utilize services. And so when we think about the impact of that as it's related to outcomes for students, but also for families. There are also continued systemic barriers that families face, particularly racially marginalized families. And so our panelists will kind of hit on some of those as we go throughout the afternoon together. And then we want to think about how some of the diagnostic disparities reflect provider bias. So again, these are just kind of laying a bit of the foundation of some of the factors that contribute to the research that our panelists will be sharing today. Some of the work that we've talked a little bit about in some of the work that I've done is this idea of colorblind ideology and how that relates to provider bias. And so we want to think about the importance of really recognizing race, ethnicity, and culture, and understanding the factors that are related to that. We also want to consider methodological barriers. So we'll get into a little bit of some of the research designs and maybe thinking about, perhaps in our conversations a little bit later, what are some of the methodological barriers that impact racially and ethnically marginalized families or participants engaging in research, right? So what might we do to better support that? And then broadly, what do we need to do to recruit and retain racially and ethnically marginalized researchers, including those who identify as autistic? So these are just kind of some things that I wanted to throw out there as we're getting into our discussion. And if you're thinking about questions later on, we're gonna really hope to open this up for conversation with our panelists. So we'll use these as just some starting points there, but I am going to turn it over to Renita to kick us off on conversations around partnerships during the IEP process.
Thank you. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some things that I've worked on in the last year or so that center around this question of partnerships in the IEP process broadly, and then more specifically as it relates to race and ethnicity. So the next slide kind of just gives us a little bit of an overview of two concepts that I have thought about as it relates to partnerships in the IEP process that are used when you think about partnerships in the healthcare field. And that's the idea of activation and shared decision making. Activation being the idea of how knowledgeable or prepared someone is to manage or navigate their health and the healthcare system. And shared decision making, and you can see in this image, related to how is information shared and how are we considering both the perspectives of the patient, in this instant patient, but carrying this information over to the education system. How are we considering that as it relates to the knowledge that the provider has, as well as the knowledge that a parent or an autistic individual or whoever is engaged in the education process has? And so in doing some of this and going into the next slide, we're thinking about the idea of, this is just kind of what the research says as far as some of the things that facilitate that process in the IEP meetings, as well as barriers. And as you can see, a lot of these, both the things that facilitate the IEP process, as well as the barriers, really center around how communication is happening, whether that be an understanding of certain information, being able to describe in detail what the system is like and being able to recognize and understand the system, as well as just having access to interpreters or having access to information that is scaffolded in a way that parents can understand. And these are specifically highlighting the idea that if you have some of those positive communication experiences, whether it be interpreters, then the experience in the IEP meeting improves. But if you're lacking some of those things or lacking consideration for culture or not adding value to the family's perspective, then we're really seeing that as a barrier, or parents are describing that as barriers within the IEP process. And so what you'll see on the next slide is the idea that when I was talking very briefly about the idea of activation, what we wanted to look at was, if you have these higher levels of, or these differences in activation, or feeling prepared in going into an IEP meeting and feeling like you're knowledgeable, does that differ in how you experience that IEP meeting? So that idea of IEP satisfaction, and that second measure being this idea of shared decision making. And what you can see here are folks that are demonstrating lower skills in this idea of activation or being prepared, are showing significant differences in both their satisfaction with the IEP process, as well as their description of the shared decision-making experience. So then I wanted to carry that over into, what does that look like across different racial groups, or specifically dichotomizing those into Black and or white and non-white. And on the next slide, you'll see that there aren't, at least in this part of things, there weren't differences in both in activation as well as shared decision making. And we're interestingly enough, seeing some slight differences in the idea of this one specific variable of providing specific information, which is something that we think about when we're talking about shared decision making. And we were seeing that in this the non-white group as described here. But when we look in more detail, so this went into some of the quantitative information. When we carry that over into some of the qualitative information, you'll see that the description of what parents were describing in these two different groups on the next slide, you'll see that there's this idea that while there weren't much differences in the quantitative experiences, we are seeing some of these qualitative differences as it related to how positive communication or how often positive communication was being displayed in the IEP meeting or process. And this is interviews with parents and parents describing this information, as well as just the ability, we're seeing that white families, or at least in this study, describing that they are mentioning the ability to manage the opposition within an IEP meeting better. And then you'll see in the Black group, or the non-white group, which was primarily Black, this higher expression of just negative behaviors or negative interactions that are happening within the IEP, between the IEP team and the parent, as well as them describing just more systemic barriers in trying to access services, which I know we'll talk a little bit more in detail about, or just trying to navigate the system in general. And so on the next slide, we'll just kind of summarize some of the thoughts or findings around what this might lead us to think about in more detail. And the idea is that if we think about shared decision making, which I didn't talk a lot about, but I'm happy to talk about more, it could be useful in these collaborative practices broadly, and as well as considering how prepared or ready that idea of activation goes into with parents in IEP meetings. And then also thinking really about how shared decision making and activation really embrace some of these qualities of race, culture, and ethnicity, and the different that are, if we're considering things like culture and value, which is important in shared decision making, how will that improve the IEP process in general? So that's kind of what we're thinking about as we think about what we notice from what parents are describing, as well as these principles that we're seeing in healthcare research that are really demonstrating shared decision making and activation being important, and really considering how that can apply to IEP processes broadly, as well as specifically to support people from different racial and ethnic groups.
Thank you so much, Renita, for kicking us off with the first research spotlight. So if you have, some questions or thoughts that are starting to, turn there, we'd love to have you kind of put a pin in those, and we're going to walk through the rest of our research spotlights. If you have questions that you want to throw in the chat, feel free to do that, and we'll work those in as well. But in the meantime, we're going to move ahead to Jeanette, who's going to talk about differences and disparities in service use.
Okay, so one of my research interests is in the differences and disparities in services use, and I am also a speech language pathologist. So I originally started off looking at allied health professions, so speech and OT and PT, but I'm very grateful to Jessica and Kara, who allowed me to analyze their data that was provided through the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism that looks at a couple of different services. So when I think about the differences and disparities, I think a lot of times I first jump to the quantity of services, or which services are individuals with autism or autistic individuals accessing. But I also feel like it's really important for us to think about, or for me and a lot of you all to think about, the quality of the services that they are accessing too. So I'm going to briefly talk about two different studies and hopefully be able to tie in some important areas in both of those aspects. So first, looking at quantity of services, as I mentioned, I analyzed some data from the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism, and I have focused in, or this is focused in on autistic high school students, because a lot of times when we're thinking about service access or service use, there's quite a few studies on our younger students and thinking about how race or parent socioeconomic status or different variables might impact the service use or service access for that group. But when we get over onto the older ages of students, like the high school students, we don't often focus on what services they're accessing. So it's nice to see an older age. They averaged about 16 years old. And in the table, you can see the race and ethnicity of the students. So you'll see most of the students were white. And then we had fewer students who were American Indian and Alaska Native. And in between, we had other races or ethnicities. So in general, as you will see in the next couple of figures, most of the students were not accessing home or community-based services. And on this figure, I've shown which services were being accessed. So counseling was being accessed the most, but only by 20%, so roughly like 1/5 of the sample, and physical therapy was being accessed the least. And you can see the other services in between. So some examples of others like ABA or applied behavioral analysis, or some people wrote like CAP services or mentoring or tutoring. And you'll also see social skills, speech language therapy, occupational therapy, and vocational rehabilitation. So in general, a lot of students were not accessing home or community-based services, but we still wanted to analyze if there were racial differences or ethnicity differences in the services that were being accessed. So on the next slide, you'll see that of all the services listed on the previous slide, this is where there were some differences. And this is like fresh off the press or preliminary data. So we might have to do some additional analyses. So like we can think about this, but maybe not take it as like definite at this point. But the main differences are where those stars are. So our children who are our students who identified as being Asian accessed any service at all less than our white students. So they were more likely to not access a service compared to our white students. For counseling, our Black students were more likely to not access counseling when compared to our white students. But the reverse was true for occupational therapy, where our Black students were more likely to access occupational therapy compared to our white students. But as you can see with the percentages, still not many students are accessing any of these services. So these are very small numbers that are accessing these services. So we go to our next slide, looking at quality of service. I'm shifting to a way younger or very younger age. These children were 13.8 months old. And this was for an intervention called the Adaptive Responsive Teaching Intervention. And so the purpose of this intervention was to deliver a parent-mediated intervention, meaning that the interventionists go in and coach the families and not focus on working directly with the child, but working with the family as a unit. And so this table shows the race, and as you can see, there aren't as many participants of different racial ethnic groups as compared to CISA. So for this study, I analyzed the data based on educational level because there was more variability in that variable. So you can see that about 1/3 are at each level, some college, 4-year college, or graduate professional degree. So on the next slide, you can see that there were 2 behaviors where there was differences based on educational level. And the first was joint interaction. So going in and working with the family, so with the parent and the child, or no coaching, child focus, going in and working directly with the child. And as you can see for our families, who had some college or less, interventionists were more likely to go in and work directly with the child versus for families who had a graduate or professional degree or four-year college degree, interventionists were more likely to work with the child and the parent together. So thinking again about quantity of services, what services our students are receiving or our children are receiving or adults are receiving, but also thinking about quality of services, I feel like is a big step for my future research areas of interest.
Great.
Thank you. Sorry, I
Oh,
was
no, that's okay.
I was trying to get to unmute. Thank you so much, Jonette. And Jess is going to talk about evidence-based practices. So I'll let you take it away, Jess.
Great, thanks.
Kara.
This, I'm presenting on a study that is published in open access, actually. So everyone, I don't know, Kara, maybe you can get the link and pop it in the chat for people. So this is part of the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. And actually, Jamie and Kara were both part of this article. And then Melissa Savage, who's also on the call, like joining this call, was part of the systematic review that was published. So this was definitely a big team effort to accomplish this. This systematic review looked at data from 1990 to 2017, and we did a really broad scan of the literature to identify anything that might be intervention for basically birth through 22 years old. And in the end, we narrowed it down to 1,013 studies. This was done in 2 stages. So there was a previous round of the review that covered that Connie Wong led, and Kara was a part of, that covered 1990 to 2012. And then this was like adding the next, or 2011, and then this was adding the next 6 years. So it covers a full 22 years. And the combined study total again was over 1,000. And so the main evidence-based practice, or the systematic review, focused on just like what practices are evidence-based. But we went back and did a secondary analysis to look at the reporting of race and ethnicity data, as well as the inclusion of participants from different racial and ethnic groups. And so what you see here is just kind of a summary of some of our key takeaways. There are definitely many, but like I think our team was all expecting West et al. And including Jason Travers kind of did this study in 2016 where they looked at the initial set of data, and the reporting was really low. And so we were adding data from like 2012 on, and we thought, oh, the reporting is going to go up substantially and it's going to be a huge increase. And half of these studies are from the new review, and the results were really alarming. So only 25% or 252 of the just over 1,000 articles actually published any data on race and ethnicity. So it's just totally absent from 3/4 of the articles. And then we looked at the trend to see like the increase in reporting, and on average in the last 5 years, there's been an increase of about 2%, a little under 2% per year. So you can imagine that won't get us very far, even in 10 years from now, right? We'd only be up to 35%. And so that is a huge problem to begin with, is that we just don't know who a lot of these studies, like who the kids are and what their race and ethnicity are in a lot of these studies. So once we determined the 252 studies that did actually identify race and ethnicity of the participants, we went on to look at the makeup of those participants, and we looked at it in a couple different ways. One was just looking at if studies included anyone from a given racial and ethnic category. And then the other was looking at the actual participant numbers, like the percentage of participants. So the data you see here spans across a number of different racial and ethnic categories. And so we had, let's see, 7 categories total that represented different races, ethnicities. And then there were a couple other categories. There was multiracial, and that had been, we had very like definitions to define what that meant. And then there was combined, and that was when studies used like a catch-all category. So if they said non-white, or did something like where they lumped a bunch of categories together in like other. So maybe they had a couple key categories and then had other, and then the missing where there was just data that was missing from the set. So this data represents a little over 4,500 participants across the 252 studies. And what you can see here is white participants are definitely the largest group. And then you can kind of scan over and see like there were higher levels of participation from Black, Hispanic, and Latino families and Asian. And then after that, it kind of drops off pretty substantially. And then the other group that's got higher numbers is that combined category where it's like lumped into a general category. I should say here also the bar graph represents the blue is the total studies, and then the orange is group design, and the gray bar is single case design. So the group designs, because of the nature of group designs, is accounting for about 4,000, a little over 4,000 of the participants, and then the single case design is about it's like 450 or 500 participants. So what we saw for inclusion of participants when we looked across domains is that the joint attention, play, studies that address joint attention, play, and vocational domains were more likely to have like a more diverse representation. And we have some ideas about reasons for that. It could be where some of these studies were concentrated. There's a lot of joint attention and play studies that come out of UCLA, and there is a more diverse kind of recruitment base there. But it also might be that these are kind of more domains that tend towards naturalistic settings. So maybe they're more likely to be in schools or the community compared to like more clinic-based targets. So, and then for the individual evidence-based practices, it really varies greatly, kind of inclusion. As far as reporting, there were only 3 evidence-based practices that had reporting, were reporting race and ethnicity in above half of their studies. And then one thing that I just looked at, it wasn't in our paper, but I was trying to think of how to summarize it, is I looked at the current census data for like 18 and under, and the 18 and under population is 47.3% white. So when I looked across EBPs, there were only 5 EBPs that were kind of under that, meaning that they potentially had representation that would be similar to what we might be seeing in our young autistic participants today, or our young autistic clients and students. So the key thing to remember here is for the inclusion of participants, this is only on like 1/4 of the studies. It's just on those 25%. So we have no idea what inclusion was like in those other studies. And so that's definitely a big limitation when you have underreporting. So that's kind of a summary. There's a lot more details in the article about things, but the big takeaways were researchers need to report this data, and that the representation in the studies definitely does not reflect our current demographics in the US.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you everyone for doing our spotlight. So we are going to move into a conversation, and I'm actually going to take down the screen share so it feels more like a conversation via Zoom, if that's okay. And I will kick us off with a couple of questions from for our panelists. And then please feel free to add other questions in the chat. I think we have a couple so far. I wanted to kind of loop back around to Renita, your conversation earlier about IEPs. Can you talk a little bit more about, what can you speak to how higher expressions of negative behaviors in Black families, kind of what that might look like and what factors contribute to this?
Yeah, so this came up in just doing some structured interviews with families, and a lot of what families described as it related to negative behaviors or negative like interactions between folks on the IEP team and navigating that process were really around this idea of active lack of empathy, and demonstrating like some closed-minded or reluctance to provide services, as kind of when we're thinking about parents making requests, and just the actual responses to those being having the description that the parents provided being much more negative than what came about from the non-white or the white parents that were discussing their experiences in the IEP meeting. So that was a lot of kind of some more specifics of what was described, just like the idea of some active lack of empathy and just more negative wording in their responses to parents' requests. And I think that gets at what you're asking as far as kind of the what and why. Just diving deeper is something that we need to kind of explore. I mean, I think that this isn't the first time that this has been described, as far as maybe not in a racial context, but just in general, parents having these negative experiences in IEP meetings, but recognizing that race may play a role in the frequency in which they're happening, or kind of the responses that parents are getting in some of these contexts are important to kind of think about as we're engaging or interacting as researchers and professionals with parents of autistic individuals.
And Renita, just to follow up, have you looked or explored like some of the cultural nuances or experiences that might play a role in families' perceptions
Of how the interaction works between them and IEP team members? I would say, as far as research goes, I'm thinking more from an anecdotal perspective, but not, I don't necessarily have the knowledge base of specifically how culture plays a role into that engagement or what research has said in regards to that. But I can think as it is connected to other ideas and what certain concepts of just more certain interactions between Black families and people in general, not necessarily in the IEP context, really taking any kind of combativeness as being very angry or having that kind of specific expression, versus in white context, it might be be connected to passion or being driven or something like that. But I don't have knowledge base specifically in the context of IEP meetings, but that would be interesting to explore for sure.
Thank you. I mean, I think even thinking about those sort of culturally nuanced components is really important. And that helps to give some context, especially in thinking about how families partner and understanding. So one of the other things I was thinking about as you were talking is the role of stigma and how families perceive. I've talked a little bit with someone else about this sort of like idea of this double layer of stigma. Like Black families in particular are already aware of stigma related to disability and mental health. And then there's also the stigma of being stigmatized, right? And so there's multiple layers, I think, that plays a role in how we partner, but also how parents and families perceive themselves in those partnerships. So thank you so much for kind of digging a little deeper in that. And we have a few more questions, but I want to move to another question for Jonette. So based on your research, what would you say is one of the first steps to increasing access to home and community-based services for racially and ethnically minoritized or marginalized families? Where do we start? I know that's a big question, but what's the first step?
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I think, especially, I mean, this data is for high school students. So when we're getting into this older age, thinking about like, does their insurance cover it? I feel like being aware of the services available and having providers that can, or service providers that can give or provide those services are like two big important things. So I guess and also being able to fund it. So that's like a third one. But I think there's so many barriers, and I don't know if parents or caregivers always know what services are available, especially as the students are reaching older ages, and then how to get those services and who's providing those services. So like my work usually focuses more on the younger ages, but when I was working, I saw there was differences in my younger kids who had access to early intervention, who may be starting like preschool or elementary school. They were accessing a lot of services in school as well as outside of school. But then my high schoolers, as they were aging out, it was like, once high school is over, you're done. Like they weren't getting any services in school because they weren't in school, and they also weren't accessing it outside of school. They probably could have benefited from some additional services, but there was no like continuity. Not many people were discussing how do you get these services and who's going to fund it.
And I think that last point has been a big sort of area of focus in our field across our disciplines, right? In terms of how do we support young adults, and specifically young autistic adults, as they age out of school, and support them into young adulthood and vocational supports, et cetera. So I think for historically marginalized families, that the pressures of that transition is often heightened. And so it's really critical to think about what might those services look like, where do we access them, and how do we build in that continuity like you mentioned. Okay, and then one more question for Jess and Kara. You talked a little bit about, understanding some of the underrepresentation related to EBPs. So given this underrepresentation of racially and ethnically marginalized students in autism research, there's been this conversation, and I'm smiling because I've talked a lot about this with our DAD board. There's been some increased discussion around, for whom are these practices evidence-based? So what might you say about that? Can you talk a little bit more about what EBPs for all could look like or might look like?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I'll kind of reiterate a few things Jeff said and add some other ideas. But what you just mentioned, Jamie, is I think that the biggest criticism of the work around EBPs is that we're identifying these practices without considering for whom they have an impact. And so this work that Jess highlighted is like the very first baby step of starting that conversation to at least start identifying in the small subset of samples for whom the EBP was delivered and what those outcomes were. So I think that's the first step. We need much more transparency in the field about who's engaged in these studies. To get to the EBP for all stage, I think we have to do a much better job about partnering with community agencies and schools and other community groups that are embedded in diverse communities, so that when we're developing interventions, we have a sense from the beginning of how are we making sure that these interventions are culturally responsive and culturally relevant and developed in the communities in which we would like to deliver them and serve. And so from the beginning too, you can identify what might be potential barriers for access to those interventions, and we can address that from the development phase. I think that's a huge important step to getting to an EBP for all. And then kind of I think partnership with that is we need to do a much better job of recruiting nationally representative samples in our studies, and community partnerships are one way to do that, but there are lots of considerations so that we can see, do these EBPs replicate across groups? Are we making sure that needs of all are being met? Other options beyond that are oversampling populations who are historically marginalized. So making sure that we have larger percentages of diverse race participants of various race and ethnicities. So that then again, we can look at both outcomes, but also have in-depth rigorous conversations around barriers and facilitators to accessing those interventions. But those would be the steps that I would say to move towards that EBP for all, but others may have things to add.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Jamie, can I just jump in with one thing? This is coming from, actually Jeanette, Renita, and I are all SLPs by training. So, but this is from an ASHA publication, I have looked up kind of CEC's definition of evidence-based practice, but I do think like one thing we get caught in like systems is sometimes like, we obviously want to use evidence-based practice, but research is not the only factor to consider there. And ASHA has like a really nice conceptualization that they're now expanding to like take into account like family and cultural, like family values, cultural perspectives, take into account internal evidence. So how are the students responding to these practices when you're working with them, not just some big study that was done in, Washington State that's far away from you or something. And then, now I'm blanking on the other piece. Expertise, like expert opinion. So we are all experts in different areas, special education, exceptional children, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists. So I do think like there is the aspect of identifying evidence-based practices from research, which is what we were particularly focused on, but not to get lost, like not to lose out on like, that's not the only thing that contributes to evidence-based practice as like I don't know, a goal. So
I appreciate that so much, Jess, like really thinking about the application, right? And Kelly mentioned, I was literally thinking social validity as you were talking, and Kelly put that in the chat, right? And really thinking about to what extent are these practices supportive for families? Are they important, right? I've worked with families who are like, this particular strategy or skill is not important. Like, I want my child to be able to go to church with me on Sundays, right? So really thinking about those experiences and the social validity for families and for our students, children, participants broadly is really important. So I really like the idea of thinking about evidence-based practices more broadly and understanding that in situational contexts. So we have a few questions in the chat. I'd love to give you all an opportunity to ask those if you'd like to. I'm happy to ask them, but I've been talking a lot. So if anyone wants to jump in and ask your question, please feel free. I know we had a couple. One of the earlier ones was actually for Renita. And this one was around any work that's been done, equitable. So what work, if any, has been done looking at equitable SDM for older youth and adults with autism, specifically those who might have comorbid or complex communication needs? Do you know?
So, I mean, shared decision-making is primarily a concept used in the medical field. So if you get a diagnosis, how does your provider support you in making a decision and involve you in making that decision? And so some of the things I wanted to do was see how some of the concepts applied in that really could carry over into the autistic community or other developmental disability worlds. So there's not really, to my knowledge, much research on the direct idea of shared decision making and older children or comorbidities. So the idea of collaboration is addressed in some areas, but it's primarily, there's nothing that I am thinking back to kind of all my literature reviews that I know of that specifically addresses, well, there are things that address it in the context of like transition services, transition from like high school and beyond. How are there collaborative processes involved in that? But nothing specific to the idea of shared decision making. But Kelly, I'm happy to expand on that too.
Yeah, I thank you. I actually raised my hand again because I'm like, oh, I have a couple of SLPs and they're researchers. I have to ask this question. So I've been really trying to figure out, it's kind of adding to the literature that's kind of about causal agency, like Sjogren's work and Waymeyer's work of causal agency and self-determination, but also looking at how people are represented in the research, meaning not only looking at all kind of different demographic variables, but also looking at the voice of the person with the exceptionality and how their voice is being represented in the work. And I feel like as I try to crack that nut, I'm just thinking about how would we raise the voice, include the voice, and really even capture the voice of the people who we are advocating for when they already have complex communication needs. So that's just been a little nut I'm trying to crack, and I would love any thoughts. I hope it doesn't get too off in the hills about, but it is still really focused on, I guess, linguistic difference as well. It's really about that underrepresentation of participants who we really do serve. So I'm just curious as to any thoughts you guys have.
Anyone want to tackle that, Jess?
I can try. I mean, I think that is a fabulous point. I think I know certainly among my colleagues here, including Kara, we've had lots of talks within the autistic community, whether it's autistic researchers or autistic self-advocates of like, which there certainly are some individuals that are non-speaking that are using communication devices that are quite like, you know, verbal with those communication devices, but I think we are missing the voice of a population. And certainly in CISA, we tried to do some like interviews when they went into young adulthood. So that's the secondary education study that Jeanette was talking about. And really think through their perspectives. There were interviews early on in the CISA study in focus groups. And one of the things they found is that Eric Carter led a lot of this work at Vanderbilt, is that many of the autistic youth preferred to do interviews via chat rather than speaking, regardless. So that would obviously be someone who can spell and type. So that, but just thinking like for autistic youth in general, like what is the way they're going to share that information? I think that's really interesting, thinking about both kind of the direction Renita and Jeanette are heading to, as far as like IEP meetings and self-advocacy or advocating for services when you're in that kind of transition stage. So yeah, and I see Kara typed something in about Aspire. So yeah, I don't have great ideas on that, but I definitely agree. And I think, you know, in IEP meetings, we can turn to the students and say, yeah, how are you involved? And Kara's doing a study with Carrie Shogren right now. So even though she's the one non-SLP of our group, she might have thoughts about kind of what within self-determination, how they're doing that in high schools.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, you look at all the evidence-based practices, a lot of them are based in behavior analysis, which a lot of people who identify as autistic, been labeled as autistic, they are not fans of, right? And they've been able to vocalize that and I'm a BCBA, so I'm aware. But they've been able to really vocalize that and self-advocate. And I really would like to hear from others. But I think it's a really challenging data point to gather.
So part of this conversation is making me think of, again, I'm like always piecing together conversations I've had with colleagues around this idea of methodological gatekeeping, right? So like, how are our research designs actually prohibitive for some participants, right? Whether they come from racially, ethnically marginalized backgrounds, or whether they are individuals with more significant support needs. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there and see if we have thoughts or ideas about how do we intentionally, as researchers and as collaborators, as practitioners, engage in practices that are genuinely more inclusive across support needs, in addition to other areas of diversity. Thoughts about that? Lots of work, lots more work to do.
Yeah, and Jamie, the group, yeah, and anyone can answer, but the group I put in Aspire, just one example, and there are more and more across the country of research groups that are led by autistic researchers who are centering autistic voice using methodology, community participatory research. We're just, I think, starting that work here at UNC. A number of colleagues are starting that, and we are thinking about our assent procedures. So we now have like a video that we provide for the assent process, so students can opt in or out. You know, they don't need to be verbal. The comprehension, we're really trying to match different comprehension levels through the video, but just really starting to think about how can people engage or not engage, and how can they participate. We have our assessments in various languages and online and on paper, and trying to reach various modalities, but we are learning from people who are far advanced than we are in doing that. I think we're kind of in the baby steps here.
Yeah, I think that's important too, and recognizing that and getting started with those initial steps. And just added in the chat, creating supports for ways to respond to questions that are multimodal, right? So I think our flexibility in terms of researchers is really important, and being able to adapt, right, and to meet the needs of our participants broadly is a critical step to be able to engage in that. Kelly, I think you were about to jump in, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, no, I appreciate it. And I think I kind of go back to, and it sounds like this is what Aspire is, but you know, a lot of times I end up back in the same space, which is this idea that representation really does matter. We really need our researchers to be really representative of the participants and their families. You know, I have a lot of families who I work with who have who are maybe undocumented, and so there's a feeling of insecurity already. And then you talk with somebody who seems like really official, and that gets even scarier. And then and then my whiteness can get in the way, and that can seem scary. So like there's kind of these barriers where you know, it's really helpful to have somebody who I think represents or who they can identify with, right? No matter what that looks like, even, you know, even the Aspire autistic researchers, right? So this idea of like, all right, I feel safe. I kind of trust that you understand my perspective a little bit and understand maybe why I am trepidatious about getting involved in this. Because I do think that that's where some of this falls apart, is in that informed consent space, right? So it's not that the participants don't exist. It's that, you know, I know that I'm just speaking from my own experience that there is some fear, especially again, around more of the undocumented families, but that's a real fear, and not wanting to sign anything that could go back to anything. That's just one example. So it comes back to representation and how it matters that we have a really diverse researchers,
Mhm.
all kinds.
That's a great example, Kelly. Thank you. It
Yeah.
was, go ahead,
I was
Jeff.
going to say that also impacts participant payments, right? Like here, as soon as we go above $200, you have to get like social security numbers. So it's like there are, I'm sure there are teams that have, you know, workarounds for this, but then you also may not be able to fairly compensate people as part of the study.
Yeah. And to Kelly's point, I wanted to actually circle back to you, Jess and Kara, about some of the recommendations related to having more representative, more diverse faculty and researchers, particularly in higher ed, and even more diverse practitioners, right? Can you kind of share maybe a couple of those recommendations? What do we do at the systemic level to address that underrepresentation?
You want to go, Jess, or do we? Either way.
Ready, go,
Yeah.
solve the problems.
Yeah, well, yeah, solve problems. So, I mean, obviously doing what we can to look at barriers for entry. So how can we make sure that, you know, budding researchers across diverse race ethnicities have access to higher education through, you know, research funding, fellowships, things that aren't going to require a long-term payback. So ensuring that we're very thoughtful about recruiting, funding, retaining diverse students through undergrad, master's, and graduate programs. I think that's key. I think being thoughtful in just the recruitment, but also the retention strategies. So once we have faculty and researchers of color in our institutions, what are we doing to actively ensure that there's a community in which they feel safe and fully engaged, and you know, feel like they're able to do the work that they are hoping to do. So I think those are some of the very basics, is the ensuring access, and then working on thoughtful retention strategies once they're on the team.
Yeah, totally echo that. One thing that I've been thinking about is like, I don't think this applies quite as much maybe in some of the work we do, though still could, but certainly in psychology settings, is like this this pipeline of undergrads who will provide free labor for you, and who like how that, so you have kids coming in and saying like, I'll volunteer in this lab and I'll give you, you know, 10 hours a week. And just so like how we're how disparities exist from the beginning, partly because research is like reliant on free labor, and so there's some systemic problems there. And so I try to think about like yeah, like I don't want to just accept all emails of people who are like, I'll do this for free, because you're really then at a point where you're like, who can afford to do that work for free in college, and like where, like who, like, you know, these are people who are, you know, maybe coming from families who also have like this is how you network, and you just reach out to everyone, like all these skills. So I think thinking about how we as researchers think about like equitable hiring practices in like even our student groups of researchers, and then how we think about like if we're on campuses, how can we be supportive of getting undergraduates into that research pipeline, whether that's teaching like, okay, how do you find a lab that aligns with the work you're interested in, or like what do you like, how you advocate for what experiences you want in a lab experience or something like that. So, and that's sounding very yeah, traditional, like NIH funding. I realize as I'm saying lab over and over again, but I do think there's so many things that like I know I need to work on and think about more.
That's such a great point, Jess. I actually experienced that this year when I was hiring students for my team and realizing that the students who were reaching out, I later figured it was part of it was my fault in terms of not figuring out the funding sources, but the students who were interested originally weren't eligible for work study pay, right? So like I had to be very intentional, which in hindsight, I need moving forward to specifically recruit students who are on our work study program, because many of them are more representative, but they're also like looking for opportunities to engage in research, but they aren't always funneled to us in the same way, right? So to your point, you sometimes have to navigate in different ways to be able to recruit more diverse students in that way. So there's lots of like red tape and you know, sort of gatekeeping in different ways that really can be prohibitive. So I think as researchers, we have to be really intentional about, like to Kara's point, creating safe spaces for our students, but also just being really intentional about recruiting them and retaining them in teams and building in that into that research pipeline. So we have just 2 minutes left. Are there any other questions or comments? I'm going to share my screen once more just for some information about DAD, but I'd welcome any last comments or thoughts.
It does look like there's one, Jamie.
Oh, thank you, Kara. You're so good with the chat. I always miss these.
Oh no, just a hand raised.
Okay.
2 hands raised.
Okay. I'm sorry, I do not want to mispronounce your name. Sinjin?
That's right, yeah. So my question was to Dr. Artis. The question I have is, you know, obviously we're seeing this disparity of, in general, of students not, and those with these disabilities not getting the services. But what is the biggest reason you think that this is not occurring, and what can we do to fix that? I mean, because I know you addressed that briefly before already, but just kind of like why is it not happening?
Yeah, so I think especially with the CISA data, I can't say that they're not getting the services in school. So I think that's a big question. Like if they are not getting the services in their home or community, then are they getting it in school? And if the answer to that is no, or either way, I think really understanding the benefits of the service as children age, and then like being able to find those services. So like as a speech language pathologist, a lot of times for our younger kids, we say like, are they talking? You know, and so as they get older, hopefully we have some system for them to communicate. So it's not being able to produce a word, or maybe not necessarily like a phrase or a sentence, but getting into, can we talk about this topic? Can we hold conversation? So as students are aging, I think our goals are going to have to shift. And so our providers need to know like what to work on, you know, and then our students and families need to know who is providing that service and how can I access it. So I think there's a couple of things going on. And then as we've talked about social validity, what's important to the students and what's important to the family. So we need to figure out like what services do they want, and we can provide those services, you know, so thinking about that. So there's a couple of things I think that we need to think about especially as we're getting into the older ages, but definitely also into the younger ages, because I think a lot of our research is what we think our families and students and kids need, but we're going to have to start asking what they want and need as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And then one more question from Karen.
Hi, and I do apologize. This question is going back to, you probably covered it. I had to step away for a second. That Glenda asked, do you feel parents with higher education are well versed in IEP meetings because they have the tools and the knowledge based to challenge the IEP team? And I'm a parent resource coordinator, so I am a parent working with parents. And I didn't hear the answer, but I was going to give a scenario on what was and I guess I'll give the scenario because it may bolster what was said. But as for higher education, and it's the wrong word to use to say a coded language, but I've worked with parents, African American or other diverse representation, and that has not helped them, believe it or not. And I call it a coded language because once they get in there, certain things are said that, and it could go to being cultural, but certain things are said that they take the words that are given to them saying that their children cannot be helped or will not be helped. And I'm in two situations, the parents had pulled their kids from the school system, and I had to have a conversation with them on that. So when you said higher education, it did not specify anybody in particular, but I just kind of wanted to follow back up on that to see what this group thought about that.
Anybody want to tackle that?
I mean, I have a comment. I'm not a panelist. Experience though. I'll tell you this, it doesn't matter how educated the parents are, in my opinion, in my experience, it's not even a matter of that. It is, I feel in my experience, it's very much on the school end. If they feel confident, and it's usually the leadership, if they feel really confident about what they're doing and that they are doing the best that they can for that student, and they have that confidence and willingness to partner with the families, then usually things are fine. It's usually when there's a bit of fear because they're not really sure and they haven't really paid much attention to what we're supposed to do with those students in that back room, because that's where I worked in that back room where they wouldn't even come look in my classroom because they didn't want to set my students off, who they were not going to set off, but they were scared of that, my administrators. So I had to actively work with the parents prior to IEP meetings so that when we went in there, the parent and the teacher were ready to go in and say, this is kind of what we're hoping is going to happen with this IEP. So the administrator, I'm not suggesting that teachers do this out there. I'm just saying that was my experience. Kind of, I needed to do that, or else the families, it doesn't matter how much education they had, they may not have been able to navigate the system, like truly navigate it.
Absolutely.
That was my experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I hate to cut it short, but we are almost 5 minutes over, and I do want to respect everyone's time. Hopefully we can continue these conversations. Our next chat is coming up in November, so we'll make sure to get that communication out to everyone. And if you're interested in engaging with DAD in other ways, there's information here on the screen. You can also reach out to me at my email address, which is also on the screen. But I want to just thank our panelists again for sharing your knowledge and your time with us this afternoon. And for all of you who have attended, I'm really excited and really invigorated by starting these up again, and look forward to continued partnerships. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the evening. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks again, Jess. Thanks, Anita. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.